In this video, we're going to be making this roll top stuff sack, and it's gonna complete your hammock and make it nicely stowed and packed. So it's got a buckle closure and you can open it up. There's some extra space that you can put your suspension straps in, and you can store your hammock and everything in it. We're going to need the fabric, which is cut at 18 inches by 18 inches. Check out the blueprint below. That will give you information on the dimensions for the whole project. And then we have 26 inches of 1/2-inch webbing and a 1/2-inch buckle. Then of course you'll need sewing machine and your thread. So the ends of our webbing are heat sealed already, and you can look at the other video if you want to learn how to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to do a double fold hem about a 1/4 inch on the top, just on one side of the fabric. And this is going to be the part that we're going to end up putting our webbing on, but we just want to cover this raw edge. The rest of the edges will be covered by our French seams. This one we're going to go ahead and just sew a straight stitch all the way across our double fold hem. So for this bag, we're going to be doing French seams. The reason why we're doing French seams is they leave us with a nice finish and they're strong without having to add any extra weight of any binding or anything like that. Okay, so we're going to fold it in half. See how we have the hem folded? We're going to keep that side upright or on the outside right now, and we're going to do a stitch. We're going to do a 1/4 inch stitch right here. So I'm just going to back stitch and then do a 1/4 inch stitch all the way down. And if you've done a French seam before, I think you get the idea. You can skip ahead because we're just going to be talking about how to do that right here. So the idea of it is we have a pretty close to the edge stitch. We're sewing all the way down, and then we're going to cut our thread and we're going to turn it inside out. And when we go inside out, we're going to get our seam at the edge, and then we're going to sew it at a 1/2 inch away from the edge, and that's going to enclose our raw edge. So our first seam was a 1/4 inch and our second one's 1/2 inch, so it's a little bit bigger. It will give us space so that when we sew this stitch, nothing's going to stick out when we turn it back over. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're going to back stitch and then again sew it at a 1/2 inch. You just want to make sure that our edge stays at the edge so you can kind of guide your fabric there. So go all the way down. Okay, so now we want to secure this stitch against our bag. And so this part can be a little bit tricky. You kind of have to stitch a little bit and maneuver your fabric, but you want to make sure that you're not sewing through both layers of the fabric. Since now we have a closed bag, you'll be stitching a little bit and then making sure that the bottom layer is not underneath the foot. And you can kind of turn it inside out or maneuver it. It's one of those things that I think once you do it and you'll kind of start to get a feel for it, it'll make more sense. Oftentimes in doing this, you might sew over it. That's okay. You'll just have to undo your stitches and go back to that point, do it again. And I promise the more times you do it, the better you'll get at it, the less likely you are to do that again. Cool, so now our seam is finished. It's nicely hidden the raw edges, and it's pressed against our fabric, as in it's not flapping. It's a flat seam now. So we're going to be doing French seams for the rest of them. So here I'm putting the seam in the middle, and now we're going to do the bottom. So the same thing happens where we'll do a 1/4 inch first, flip it over, and then do a 1/2 inch. And same thing as before, we're going to be attaching this to the main body of the fabric so that it's not flapping around. And it can be tricky to do the corners, but thankfully we won't be sewing all the way to the corners because when we make our bag 3D, we're going to be clipping off some of those corners. So we're just going to be doing kind of like the middle of it just to really secure it. So like you don't have to start, maybe you can start like an inch, about an inch away from the edge. You can sew down this piece of fabric. So I've tried to turn my fabric in a way that when I do my stitch, I'm only going to be stitching what I'm trying to stitch and I'm not accidentally catching some other pieces of the fabric inside of my stitches. Okay, so now that's done. Now this is the part where we're going to make it 3D. So with it laid out, we just have a rectangle right now, but we're going to pull it. We're going to pull it so that we have 90-degree corners. And we're going to try to flatten that part out. Now we're going to mark lines. We're going to get our ruler. And I'm going to mark a 2-inch or a total of 4 inches, so 2 inches on either side of the seam. And these lines are going to be running perpendicular to the seam that we have. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch just exactly on top of those lines. Do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so now that this is there, I want to cut off the excess fabric, and I'm going to cut it so that there's about 1/4 of an inch left, just like when we do our other seams, 1/4 inch away from the edge, so that when we turn it inside out, we can do a 1/2 inch on the other side. So now turn it inside out, and so 1/2 inch. So get them nice and flat, and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch from each spot there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side and sew my 1/2 inch. Okay, now if you want, you can secure this flap just like we did the other ones. I don't at this point. Like, I consider the bag finished enough and not quite worth the hassle of turning it inside out to try to reach that edge. But it's totally up to you. You can totally do it. You totally don't have to. I feel at this point our bag is reinforced enough, and that's why I'm not doing it. Okay, now we're going to add the webbing on top and our buckles. You want to lay it out flat and even, so that you have your two, it's like divided in half. So you have your edges. On each side of those edge, we're going to be placing a buckle. So I'm going to get my webbing out. And the first thing I'm going to do is just to secure like a couple inches on the top of this so that the webbing is just in place. So I'm just going to mark it right there so I know where to start my webbing. So I've got my mark, and I've got my webbing, and it's in place, and I'm marking the edge of where it goes to the fabric so I know where I want to stop stitching, because I want it to stop stitching slightly before the edge so that there's a little bit of room for the buckle. So I'm lining it up, and I'm going to be stitching a square, or I'm going to be stitching a rectangle on the webbing. So I'm going to stitch about 1/8 inch away from the edge of the webbing from my mark to my other mark. Needle down, and then the foot comes up to rotate it. And then put the foot back down, and then stitch again. I'll always end it with the needle down. That way, when you rotate it, you're not going to be messing with any of your stitches. And then just add a few extra stitches for locking. All right, now I'm going to take my buckle and I'm going to put it through the webbing. I'm leaving a little bit of slack, a little bit of extra webbing sticking out of the edge. And I am putting my webbing against the other edge, and we're going to clip it here just to give us a sense of exactly where we want it, and that's going to help us mark it. That's going to help us determine where to put our stitches. So my webbing is running the length of the top edge of my bag all the way to the end, and I'm marking at the end again so I know again where I'm going to stop my stitch. And I'm basically doing the same thing on this side as I did the other side of sewing a rectangle across. It's just going all the way across this time. And then I'm going to do my rectangle again, the whole length of the edge of the bag, making sure that I'm only sewing the webbing to one side of the fabric, not accidentally closing my bag. So same thing, going across the top, adjusting my bag as necessary to give myself room for sewing. And then I'm stopping with my needle down and I rotate it, just finishing up my rectangle, the same as before. And then I'm going across the top again and doing some extra stitches and some back stitches just to lock it really securely in place. I do want the webbing to be able to take a little bit of force and hold anything that's in here nice and compressed. So I want my stitches to be nice and strong. I'm unclipping my buckle and putting the other side. So I'm threading the webbing through the buckle so that it matches up. When I'm buckling my buckle up, I want it to match the other side, since on some buckles they're straight and you can flip them and it doesn't matter. However, on this buckle it's slightly curved, so I do want it to match well. So once I get it in place, just verifying that this is correct and it looks good, then I'm going to do the same thing with the last piece of webbing, or with the last stitch. I do have a few inches of extra, and I do want some overlap with my initial piece of webbing that I stitched down, but I don't need this much. So I'm going to cut it and heat seal it. So going to heat seal it. So after I cut it, I went and heat sealed it like we've done in our previous videos. This is just to prevent fraying, just to add those extra pieces of quality that are going to extend the life, even the things you don't see, but oftentimes it's the layers underneath that add the quality. Okay, unfortunately I lost a little bit of footage. Hopefully this will still make sense, but I'm going to try to explain it to you. But the same way we did the other rectangular stitches on the other parts of the webbing, you're doing the exact same thing, except that you're going to take the end of the webbing and you're going to fold it over about 1 inch of webbing on the inside to hide that raw edge, and then you're going to sew over exactly the same way. So I really hope that makes sense. So now we're going to get on to attaching it to the sewing to the hammock. So with it complete, you're going to find the middle of the hammock on the side you want to attach it to. You're going to kind of turn your bag inside out, because when we sew it, the trickiest part of sewing it is just making sure you're not sewing through a couple of layers. 1 layer of fabric of hammock, we're not catching any folded edges. And we're going to hold this in place. You can pin it if you want. You could even tape it if that's easier, or just hold it. And we're just going to do 1 stitch. And the stitch is about 4 inches long. Just going to go back stitch it, and then back stitch again to lock it off. And now it's attached. It's in the bottom third of the stuff sack because there is extra room in the stuff sack. All right, now we have it all attached. Now your hammock is complete with a nice stuff sack for good stowage. I hope you've enjoyed making your hammock and hope that you have a great time lounging in your hammock too.